very welcome.
Thank you. So I know you've heard from all sorts of incredible people today, politicians, sports people, teaching people, employing people. I'm going to talk to you about chickens. I just thought it would make a change, right? So, and I think you'll eventually understand why I'm going to talk to you about chickens. So the story I want to tell you about chickens is an academic story. It comes out of a university in the United States called Purdue University, and it concerns a scientist named William Muir. Muir was really interested in productivity, as every single employer is. But he thought, well, if you're going to understand productivity, one way to do that is to look at productivity in animals. He worked with chickens, partly because studying productivity with chickens is dead easy. All you have to do is count the eggs. So he designed this really beautiful experiment. And what he did is he took one perfectly average flock of chickens, normally productive. He put it to one side and let it do whatever it is chickens do all day long for 6 generations. But then he created another flock of the most superbly productive chickens, the sort of super chickens. And he put them all together into a super flock and let it do whatever these things do for 6 generations. And when he came back, obviously the gist of the exercise is to compare the performance, the productivity of the 2 flocks. The original flock, the average flock, has become more productive than ever. All the chickens are super healthy, fully feathered, very happy. They're producing more eggs per chicken than they ever had before. The super flock is a completely different story because all but 3 are dead. They've essentially achieved their productivity by suppressing the productivity of the rest. And when Muir presented his findings to his fellow academics, one of them jumped up and said, I know those super chickens, they all work in my lab. And I've told that story many times in many companies around the world, and I always get this kind of flicker of recognition in people's eyes because they know exactly what I'm talking about, which is they go to enormous lengths and enormous expense to employ ostensibly really successful individuals, A-stars and firsts and all that jazz. And they bring them in, and they discover they behave just like Muir's super chickens. They are totally self-centered. They regard life as a fight for survival, and they pretty much kill everybody around them. Right? And then they sort of think, well, what do we do with these people? We've got all of these soloists, all of these superstars. Everybody wants to be the star, and we can't get anything done. And part of what's happening, because of the way our education system is working at the moment, is that kids are absorbing this message, yes, definitely from television, yes, definitely from social media, but in schools also, that all of life is a fight for survival. They think that's Darwin, who spoke in this room, and by the way, it's not what he said, okay? They think it's a fight for survival. You have media telling them that actually if they don't get 57 A-stars, they're toast, they're the lost generation. And they have absorbed this message that it is sink or swim. And that's why we see, as education becomes more and more competitive, we see more and more cheating. We see more and more plagiarism. We see more and more online essay mills. We see kids taking Adderall and Ativan because if they can't hype up their cognitive performance, they're going to fall by the wayside, and then they'll just completely lose it. That's the message our kids are absorbing. They see schools competing with schools, teachers competing with teachers. They know that they're competing with their fellow students for university places. And they are coming through a deeply competitive education system, coming out of it deeply competitive individuals, and they walk into the workplace and they cannot work with anybody. And I see this over and over and over again in workplaces in this country and all over the world, because for some very complicated reason, everybody thought competition means the best gets to the top. And in fact, when you start to dig into it in real detail, the more competitive a system or a society or a corporation becomes, the higher the rate of cheating and corruption. If life is about winning or losing, then I am going to do whatever it takes to win. And if, when you start to realize this in organizations, you then start thinking, yikes, this is a real problem, right? We have a whole lot of people with very, very underdeveloped ethical sense, and we have a whole bunch of people who are such soloists they can't work together. I have to tell you, by the time they get to the workplace, doing a little bit of ethics and a little bit of teamwork doesn't really work. And I'm kind of astounded, because I spent the first decade of this century teaching ethics in corporations, and now I find myself astoundingly going into companies and teaching people actually how to talk to each other. I teach them, unbelievably, how to listen. Because mostly they don't listen because they think, if I don't get my word in fast, I'm not going to be the star of this meeting or this committee or whatever the darn thing is. So this is a real difficulty. And I'm very, very sensitive to the fact that, in general, everybody thinks that education is the cause of every problem we have, and education is the solution to every problem we have. So I feel for educators, because I think we put an incredible burden on them. But I would like to suggest that the emphasis that we have placed, and I recognize not all of this has come from educators, the emphasis we have placed on competition and the crude binary narrative we have devised around winning and losing is a disaster. It means people don't think for themselves, they just think about, how do I get the grade? How do I do what my boss wants me to do? How do I say what my boss wants to hear? This is exactly what we don't need. And it's no surprise, with this overemphasis on competition, that we have a divided nation that doesn't even know how to talk to each other, never mind listen. So what are we going to do about this? Well, I think I have a couple of ideas which I think might be helpful for schools and for employers both to start thinking about. Because if we really care about productivity, which is a serious issue here, then we really have to think very differently about how we educate and how we assess education. The first thing we've got to start taking super seriously is the arts. Artistic work is collaborative. I've spent most of my life working with artists. Novelists talk to me about collaborating with their readers. How do I write in a way that draws my reader in and sparks ideas? It looks like the most solo, isolated work, but they think of themselves as collaborating with the world and with their readers. Artists, incredible collaborators, not just with technicians, but with all kinds of different media, with gallerists, with exhibitionists, trying to understand the marketplace in which they're working. They have no chance of success if they aren't dazzling collaborators. I spent some time sitting in on the auditions at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, because I thought, well, acting looks like it's an all-about-me kind of job. Absolutely not. The young people who come in and audition at RADA, if they come in and they think it's all about them, they get nowhere, because the truth of the matter is the drama is always all about what happens between people. That's what makes it electric. Cinema, television, every art form you want to think of, music, it's all intensely collaborative. Musicians won't play with other musicians who don't listen. So the arts are a fantastic grounding, preparing people to go into the workplace where they are going to collaborate all the time on projects, in teams, in departments, where their ability to support and help each other is what creates genuine innovation and technological or commercial breakthroughs. We've got to take the arts seriously. It is not an optional extra. It is not icing on the cake. It is absolutely fundamental to how truly successful, sustainably productive organizations function and succeed. We need to find an opportunity to do far more collaborative project work across every subject at school. The great thing about project work is it necessarily raises and makes obvious issues of justice, fairness, listening. Those lessons need to start early. The questions need to start early. The critical thinking needs to start really early. We need the collaboration and relationship between schools and businesses to be much, much more rich and open. I've seen some of the work that Jane Delfino did in Manchester. It's jaw-dropping. That work has saved the futures of so many kids because a couple of employers were willing to invest some time in developing genuine, meaningful relationships with schools. Both parties collaborated richly with serious intent. It was astounding work. We also, despite, I have to say, the title of this conference, I think we need to ditch this word talent, right? There is no reliable test for talent. You can't do the blood test. DNA will not tell you. Profiling will not tell you who is going to be a high achiever in later life. Teachers think they have skills at this. They have biases at it. Yes, I have a dog in this race. Having been told that I wasn't university material, thank you, I had a wonderful time at Cambridge. Right? But this idea that there are people who have talent and people who don't is one of the most corrosive, damaging, wasteful ideas we have ever invented. It's an idea predicated on the notion of winners and losers. Everybody has talent. Everybody has capacity. Everybody has potential. It is the job of educators and employers to try and figure out what it is and what it needs to grow. It isn't going to be the same for everybody. I spent some time a couple years ago when I was researching my book, A Bigger Prize, talking to people in Singapore about education. Singapore generally does really well on the PISA tests, and it's a very interesting, very complex society. And I talked to the Minister of Education, and I talked to the heads of a couple of schools there, and they told me a really fascinating story. They said, you know, because Singapore is now 50 years old, they said, you know, when our country began, and we were so aware that we were so young and we were so fragile and we have no natural resources and we are surrounded by enemies. We thought, we've got to educate people super fast. And they invented a highly rote-driven, highly competitive education system. And it did just great for the 50 years. And then they said, you know, this isn't going to work for the next 50 years. The world has changed, and we have changed. And they went around the world to look, in England, in the United States, all over the world, to look at education systems to give them ideas about what should their second generation school system look like. And they came back horrified because everybody had copied them. And they knew they were completely anachronistic. And instead, they developed an education policy that said, actually, you know, we're this really small country. We're still surrounded by enemies. We are now 50 years old. And, you know, we don't have natural resources, but we have resources. But the thing is, we're still small. And what that means is we can't just educate a thin upper crust of people. We are now at a place in history where we have got to educate everybody. We cannot afford to lose a soul. And they started taking apart, with some very elegant experiments, taking apart this really competitive system and very rote-driven system and very streamed system, and started changing every piece of it, making it multidisciplinary, making it collaborative, giving kids a lot more options. And so I think we have to think very hard about what the education system and what our thinking about employment for the future is going to be. And anytime you talk about the future, and God help me, I'm trying to write a book about it at the moment, you walk into the land of snake oil, right? Because you can pick up any book, doesn't have to be by Yuval Harari, but it might be, to read all kinds of predictions and forecasts. I mean, no wonder tarot card reading has come back into fashion, right? There are predictions and forecasts the world over. X% of jobs will be gone by whatever year. I think my favorite one is the Oxford Martin School. 47% of jobs will be destroyed by 2035. Anybody with probably GCSE math would smell a rat here. 47%? This is a very gritty number. Is anybody going to remember this forecast in 2035? This is statistically implausible. When people start talking about what are the talents and skills we need for the future, there is only one right answer. We have no idea. We know jobs are going to change. We don't know how fast they're going to change. We don't know where they're going to change. Anybody who's read science fiction knows the one golden rule about technology is it always breaks. Okay? The second golden rule of technology, written by Bill Gates, was it does eventually come true, but never with the timing that you expect. So we don't know. What we know is that we're probably all going to live a lot longer. We're probably all, the young people of my kids' generation, are probably going to have a much longer working life than I've had, which is already longer than my father had. And we know that they're probably going to have multiple careers. And what do they need for that? Among everything else, yes, they need to be really collaborative, they need to be articulate, they need to be able to listen, they need to be able to get the best from each other, no question. An ethical sense would be really helpful. But mostly what they're going to need is an absolute love of learning. I look forward to a generation that doesn't come out of school thinking, thank God that's over. Because it's never over. We need the new generation of kids and the new generation of employers to share a love of learning, facilitate a love of learning, and develop skills for learning. And we need them to do this with real dedication, recognizing this isn't a competitive sport. It isn't a Mortal Kombat. It should be as productive, as lively and creative as breathing. Thank you very much.